100. Real estate clauses and their meanings. Acceleration clause allows the lender to demand full repayment if the borrower defaults on the loan. Alienation clause requires full loan repayment if the property is sold or transferred. Amendment clause outlines the process for making changes to the original contract. Appraisal clause makes the contract contingent on the property meeting a minimum appraised value. Arbitration clause requires disputes to be resolved through arbitration rather than court. Assignment clause specifies whether one party can transfer their rights or obligations to another. As-is clause states that the buyer accepts the property in its current condition without requiring repairs. Backup offer clause allows a seller to accept a secondary offer if the primary contract falls through. Contingency clause makes the contract dependent on specific conditions being met. Deed restriction clause limits how the property can be used or modified in the future. Default clause describes the consequences of either party failing to meet contract terms. Due diligence clause provides the buyer time to inspect and investigate the property before final commitment. Earnest money clause outlines the handling, return, or forfeiture of the buyer's deposit. Escalation clause allows a buyer to increase their offer if competing bids are presented. Escape clause permits the seller to accept other offers if the current buyer does not meet conditions. Exclusive use clause grants a tenant exclusive rights to operate a specific type of business on the premises. Extension clause allows contract deadlines to be extended under certain conditions. Financing clause makes the sale contingent upon the buyer obtaining a mortgage or loan. Force majeure clause excuses performance of contractual duties due to events beyond either party's control. Governing law clause specifies which jurisdiction's laws will apply in interpreting the contract. Habendum clause describes the ownership rights being transferred in the deed. Home sale contingency clause allows the buyer to back out if they cannot sell their current home. Indemnity clause requires one party to compensate the other for certain damages or losses. Inspection clause gives the buyer the right to inspect the property before closing. Insurance clause specifies the type of insurance coverage required for the property. Joint tenancy clause establishes ownership where surviving owners inherit the deceased owner's interest. Kick-out clause allows the seller to continue marketing the home and kick out the current buyer under specific conditions. Late payment clause outlines fees or consequences for paying late on rent or loan installments. Lease option clause gives the tenant the right to purchase the property at a set price within a certain time frame. Legal description clause includes the full legal description of the property being transferred. Liquidated damages clause predetermines the amount a party must pay if they breach the contract. Mediation clause requires disputes to go through mediation before arbitration or litigation. Merger clause states that the written contract overrides all prior agreements or discussions. Non-compete clause prevents one party from operating a competing business near the property. Non-disclosure clause prohibits parties from sharing confidential transaction information. Notice clause specifies how formal communication must be delivered between parties. Option clause gives one party the right to perform a future action, e.g., purchase or renew a lease. Possession clause defines when the buyer or tenant can take physical possession of the property. Proration clause outlines how expenses like taxes and utilities will be divided at closing. Purchase price clause states the agreed sale price of the property. Quiet enjoyment clause guarantees tenants peaceful use of the rental property without interference. Recording clause specifies when the deed or transaction will be recorded with public records. Right of first refusal clause gives a party the opportunity to buy the property before others if the seller chooses to sell. Right to inspect clause allows the buyer or lender to access the property for inspections before closing. Severability clause ensures the rest of the contract remains valid if one clause is unenforceable. Specific performance clause allows a party to force the other to fulfill the contract instead of accepting damages. Statute of limitations clause sets a time limit for taking legal action on contract violations. Subordination clause ranks one lien below another in priority. Survival clause specifies which obligations continue after the contract ends. Tax proration clause divides property taxes between the buyer and seller based on the closing date. Tenant improvement clause outlines what alterations tenants can make to the rental property. Termination clause describes how and when the contract may be legally ended. Time is of the essence clause emphasizes that all dates and deadlines in the contract must be strictly followed. Use clause defines how a property can and cannot be used by the buyer or tenant. Waiver clause states that giving up one right under the contract does not waive future rights. Assignment of lease clause allows the tenant to assign the lease to another party with landlord approval. Broker protection clause ensures the broker receives commission if a buyer they introduced later purchases the property. Right to cure clause allows a party to fix a breach before the contract is terminated. Earn-out clause delays part of the payment based on future property performance or income. Non-waiver clause states that ignoring a contract breach once doesn't set a precedent. Due on sale clause requires loan repayment if the property is transferred or sold. Environmental disclosure clause requires disclosure of known environmental hazards like mold or asbestos. Fixtures clause defines which items are considered permanently attached and included in the sale. Default interest clause applies a higher interest rate after a borrower defaults on the loan. Owner's title insurance clause specifies who will pay for the title insurance policy. Prepayment clause states whether the borrower can repay a loan early and under what conditions. Rent acceleration clause allows a landlord to demand all future rent payments immediately in case of tenant default. Rent abatement clause allows temporary rent reduction or suspension due to issues like property damage. Holdover clause defines the terms if a tenant remains after the lease expires. Access clause gives the landlord or buyer the right to enter the property for specific reasons. Early occupancy clause allows the buyer to move in before the sale officially closes. Late closing penalty clause applies a fee if closing is delayed by one party beyond the agreed date. Utilities clause specifies which party pays for electricity, water, gas, and other utilities. Non-disturbance clause protects tenants from being evicted if the property is foreclosed. Kickback disclosure clause ensures all parties disclose any referral fees or third-party commissions. Insurance proceeds clause explains how insurance payments will be handled in case of damage. Relocation clause Allows the landlord to move a tenant to a different unit under specific terms. Subletting clause. States whether the tenant can sublet the property and under what conditions. No representation clause. States that neither party is relying on verbal statements not written in the contract. Mortgage contingency clause. Makes the sale conditional on the buyer securing financing. Seller concession clause. Outlines any seller-paid costs or contributions toward buyer expenses. Closing date clause. Specifies the exact date the property transfer will occur. Rent roll clause. Requires the seller to provide a list of tenants, lease terms, and income. Assignment of rents clause. Gives the lender the right to collect rents if the borrower defaults. Option to renew clause. Gives the tenant the right to extend the lease for an additional term. Repair and maintenance clause. Clarifies who is responsible for repairs and general upkeep. Common area maintenance, CAM, clause. Outlines how shared property costs will be divided in commercial leases. Broker disclosure clause. Identifies all agents and brokers involved in the transaction. Improvement allowance clause. Specifies a budget the landlord will provide for tenant build-outs. Notice to quit clause. Outlines the process and time frame for ending a tenancy. Market rent adjustment clause. Allows rent increases based on current market conditions. Damage and destruction clause. Explains how a lease or sale is affected if the property is damaged. Estoppel certificate clause. Requires tenants to confirm lease terms for a new buyer or lender. Lease contingency clause. Makes the sale conditional on leasing or vacating a property. Financial statement clause. Requires a buyer or tenant to provide financial records upon request. Title contingency clause. Allows cancellation of the deal if the title has unresolved issues. Hazardous materials clause. Prohibits storage or use of dangerous substances on the property. Seller financing clause. Outlines the terms if the seller is offering to finance the buyer's purchase. Purchase option clause. Gives a tenant or third party the right to buy the property in the future. Entire agreement clause. States that the written contract is the full and complete agreement between parties.